welcome to episode 2 of this DimeCan series on dependency injection, inversion of control, and Castle Windsor. In the first episode, we had gone through our invoice service class and removed the dependencies from it and have them injecting through constructor injection, as you can see here. So the iInvoice repository and iTranslate invoice listing are being passed through and then being used in fetch invoice list. This is a nicely decoupled solution, allows for flexibility and some replaceability. What we were talking about at the end of the first episode, though, is how this impacts the code inside our client. And in this case, our client is a web forms or WinForms application. So this is what you'll see. What we have in button one click is the newing up of an invoice service, and because we only have that one constructor, we have to provide the dependencies to it. So we also new up invoice repository and we new up invoice listing translator. It works fine actually, but it has provided way too much information about how invoice service works into the hands of this client form application. What we don't want is to have that knowledge up there. We want our client form to be able to just say, give me invoice service object, nothing to it. So ideally, we want to be able to say something like this, just invoice service, zero constructors. We can do that through what we were showing before in the first episode of poor man's dependency injection. So we'll just create an empty constructor. We'll chain things up, we'll new up, and we'll new up the invoice translator as well. So we've got our client working over here. If we go ahead and run this, we can just click on the button. We get our invoice numbers back into our bound list. What it's doing is it's calling the zero parameter constructor, delegating off to the two parameter constructor, but it's saying you need two values in it. Here they are. Here's a new invoice repository and a new invoice to invoice listing translator. Again, it works, but it's not an ideal situation. We've lost a little bit of that flexibility. We've got some concrete implementations that are defined here that reduce our ability to replace and change what we have going on. So what we want to have is no constructor like that whatsoever. So we see no newing up of the objects underneath that invoice service requires. Ideally over here, we want it to keep looking like this, with perhaps one exception of not even having to new up the invoice service. So this is something that you can do with Castle Windsor. We'll just comment out these lines of code here so that we can do some stuff. And the first step to using Castle Windsor, of course, is going to be to reference its objects. So the first one of the three that you need is Castle Core. The second one is microkernel, which is the underlying inversion of control container that Castle Windsor uses. And we'll add in a third one, which is Castle Windsor. And we're going to do that in two places just because of how we've set up this project. So we'll add core again, and we'll add microkernel, and we'll add Windsor. So now we've got this all created in there. The next thing we want to do, like we should with any third-party utility, component, control, is we want to wrap it before we use it. So we're going to drive out that wrapper by creating a test, and we'll create that test. We'll call it dependency resolver tests. And this is should resolve requested type from underlying container. So we're going to wrap the Castle Windsor container. That's our underlying container. So what we want to get is iInvoice repository. We're not going to use the service because it has a couple of parameters going into it. Repository doesn't. Having those parameters requires us to set up a little bit more stuff to make this test work. So we'll create our invoice repository, and we want to be able to say resolve type of invoice repository. And we want to assert that what we get back is not null. So we're going to ask resolve type class and its of method, passing in a generic invoice repository. We're going to pass that in and say, I want you to create me a concrete or fetch me a concrete implementation of invoice repository and return it back out. So to test that, we have to initialize our resolve type object, and to do that, we'll say create a new Windsor container. We'll make that an iWindsor container. The next step will be to resolve type dot initialize, and we'll pass in the Windsor container. All we're doing is wrapping that Windsor container. And the step to make this test pass that we also need to do is to put in the mapping of iInvoice repository to invoice repository. So we'll say Windsor container.add component. We'll give it a key of invoice repository. We'll do type of invoice repository for the service. This is what we ask for. We'll do type of invoice repository for the class. This is the concrete object that we're going to get back. So now we've got that set up. What we need to do is actually create the class. So we'll go up inside of our infrastructure IoC. We'll add a class called resolve type. We'll jump back over to here. We'll use resharper to create the method implementation for us. Takes in a Windsor container. We want to store that in a field level object container. Create our field. There we go. Jump back over here. All we have to do now is implement of. So we'll create a method of. It takes in t and returns type of t, generic method. And to use it, we just use our wrapped Windsor container resolve t. What we have is a wrapper around Windsor container with a resolving method called of, and that delegates off to our underlining container. So we'll just save stuff up here. We'll jump back to the test, and we should be able to run the test and see it pass. So we've got a passing test now. So now what do we need to do? We need to implement it inside of our application. So we'll close down our tests. Inside of our application, we want to create and initialize the resolve type class one time at the start of the application run, and then use it for the remainder. So we'll go inside of program, and we'll do our resolve type in here. Resolve type, initialize, new Windsor container, and in here we're going to tell it to go ahead and use an XML configuration instead of the fixed configuration that we put inside of our test. So we'll say new XML interpreter, and that's all we have to do. Now our wrapper of resolve type has a Windsor container inside of it that is using our XML configuration. We're going to talk about the XML configuration in episode 3 of the series, so we won't get into what it's doing there. But essentially it has all the mappings that we put into code in our last one. So now that we've got it in there, we can go ahead and use form 1. We can uncomment these lines of code, and instead of newing up an invoice service, we can go ahead and say resolve type of iInvoice service. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, resolve type, and underneath you, Castle Windsor, go ahead and new up an iInvoice service, or new up whatever concrete class you have for iInvoice service, and return it back out for me. So what's it doing is it's going through, it's saying, oh, iInvoice service, you're related to invoice service, so I need to new up an instance of you. But you have a 2-parameter constructor. one of the parameters is an invoice repository type. Let me go out and figure out what the concrete class is for that. I'll new it up for you as well. You also need a type of iTranslate invoice to invoice listing. Let me go out and find out what's been configured in the mappings in XML and new up the concrete class that's related to this. So Castle Windsor, when you create one object, it'll use the largest constructor with the one with the most parameters, and it will walk through every object that's inside that, newing those objects up. If those objects themselves have dependencies, it'll walk through every one of the dependencies in the constructors for that and new those up as well. So it walks the whole constructor tree, newing stuff up for you. So our one line back here has gone from having new invoice service bracket new invoice repository comma new invoice to invoice listing translator to just saying resolve type of iInvoice service. Castle Windsor takes care of everything for you. We go ahead and run this. Click on the button. There we go. We're getting our data just like we were before. Next episode in this Dimecast series, we're going to talk about the configuration files, how they work, what you can do with them, and build on top of this resolve type class that we have wrapping our Castle Windsor.